What if the silence you're drowning in is actually your soul's way of asking to be heard? What if loneliness isn't a curse, but a hidden invitation? And what if an ancient voice, echoing across 2,000 years, has already written a letter to you? Yes, you. A letter that might just change everything. This is that letter. A message from Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Roman Stoic, philosopher, statesman, and teacher. But more than that, a man who knew suffering, who knew isolation, who knew what it meant to stand alone in exile, cut off from friends, from purpose, from the world that once embraced him. And yet in that silence, Seneca discovered something timeless, something he wrote down not for fame, but for clarity, for healing. And somehow it found its way to us. This video is a reimagining of what Seneca might say to you now, in your most fragile hour, when the room feels too big, when the hours feel too long, when you've stared at your phone and no one texts back, when you've wondered, am I forgotten, or will this feeling ever end? Seneca would start by telling you, you are not alone in feeling alone. He would say that even the strongest souls have met the sharp sting of isolation. That feeling separated from others is not a sign of weakness, but a universal human trial. Something every great thinker, writer, philosopher, and yes, even emperors have endured. He might then ask you a question, one so gentle it stops you in your tracks. Have you made peace with your own company? It's a simple question, but it cuts deep, because many of us are trained to avoid ourselves, to fill the silence, to escape the mirror. But Seneca, in his solitude, learned that there is no better companion than a soul that has befriended itself. He would tell you that loneliness is not just the absence of others, it is the absence of connection to your own inner life, and to heal that, you don't need a crowd, you need a conversation, not with them, with you. Seneca's own letters, written to his friend Lucilius, were full of this exact insight. Though addressed outwardly, they were inward explorations, observations, written from solitude to solitude. They became tools for reflection, quiet wisdom passed from one lonely soul to another. He wrote not to impress but to remember, not to teach but to practice, not to preach but to become. And so, if he were writing to you now, he wouldn't give you a formula, he'd give you a mirror, a place to see yourself, not through the lens of shame or longing, but through the eyes of possibility. He would write, "My dear friend, you are not broken because you are alone. You are not empty because others have gone quiet. You are simply meeting yourself at last, and that meeting can feel strange, even frightening. But stay with it. Sit beside yourself as you would a lifelong friend. Ask nothing, expect nothing, just be present. The rest will come." Can you feel the gentleness in that voice? It's not trying to fix you. It's simply reminding you that you were never broken to begin with. Seneca believed that solitude was a training ground for the soul, not a punishment, but a preparation. For what? For deeper love, for truer clarity, for calmer purpose. Because only in silence do we hear the parts of us that have been whispering all along. He would urge you not to flee your loneliness, but to examine it, to ask, what is it teaching me? What does it reveal about what I crave, about what I've avoided, about who I am beneath the noise? And you'd find something unexpected, that within the quiet there is strength, that within the emptiness there is room to grow, that within the ache there is aliveness. Seneca would gently smile and say, "No soul finds joy by fleeing itself." And you would believe him, not just because of his wisdom, but because something inside you recognizes the truth in his words. This loneliness you're feeling, it's not the end of the story. It's the turning point. The moment you stop running from solitude and start walking into it, with eyes open, with heart steady, with the soft courage of a soul choosing to stay present, even when it hurts. Because you're not alone. Not really. You've got yourself. You've got this moment. And somewhere, 2,000 years ago, Seneca wrote you this letter. Seneca would likely continue his letter, not by promising ease, but by preparing you for truth. Because the Stoics were never in the business of comfort. They were in the business of clarity. And clarity, though sometimes painful, is what allows the soul to breathe. He would write, "Your pain is real. Your loneliness is real. But neither defines you. They are visitors, temporary travelers on the road of your becoming. He would say that we mistake feelings for identities, that just because we feel alone doesn't mean we are unloved. Just because we feel forgotten doesn't mean we are without value. These are echoes of fear, not facts of the soul. And when we meet them with silence, we begin to see them clearly, not as enemies but as signals. Seneca believed that emotion, even painful emotion, was a tool, not something to be repressed, but something to be refined. He knew that the Stoic was not someone who felt less, but someone who understood more. And so in your most lonesome moments, he would challenge you, not to harden your heart, but to deepen it. He might ask, can you sit in your loneliness and listen to what it's trying to show you? And if you do, here's what you might find: that you've been giving away pieces of yourself to be accepted, that you've been chasing connection to avoid sitting still, that you've been craving others, not because you need them, but because you've forgotten how to be with yourself. Seneca would not shame you for these things. He would recognize them. He lived them. Exiled by Nero, cast out from the world he helped lead, he sat with his own loneliness day after day. And instead of letting it rot his soul, he wrote, he refined, he listened, and he discovered that in solitude the mind becomes sharper, the heart becomes softer, and the soul becomes visible again. He would remind you that solitude is not the absence of life, it is the gateway to deeper living. He would say, withdraw into yourself as far as you can, and let your inner sanctuary be unshaken by the storm outside. Can you imagine that kind of life, where your peace is not dependent on a text message, where your value isn't tied to who notices you, where your energy isn't drained by the chase to be understood, but instead, you become the one who sees yourself, who hears your own breath as enough, who holds the silence like a sacred space, not a suffocating one. Seneca believed that self-possession was not arrogance, it was maturity, the ability to be whole without having to be filled, and that kind of wholeness is only born in silence. And so when the world feels far away, when the laughter seems distant, when you stare at the ceiling and wonder if anyone even remembers you, he would whisper, this is the time to remember yourself. Not the self that performs, not the self that adjusts to fit in, not the self that clings to roles and titles, but the self that watches, the self that endures, the self that, when everything else is stripped away, remains. That's the self worth knowing. That's the self worth loving. That's the self that solitude introduces you to. Seneca might even suggest a practice: write to yourself, not to complain, not to spiral, but to remember, to reflect, to record what is real. As he did, line after line, day after day, through confusion, through ache, through exile, because writing clarifies, because solitude reveals, because silence heals. And perhaps he would add one final thought before closing this part of the letter. You do not need to be surrounded to be supported. You do not need to be seen to be strong. You do not need to be loud to be known. Be still. Be silent and know this: the soul that can sit in solitude without fear is already free. And now Seneca would lower his pen, close his eyes and imagine you, not just as a concept, not as a distant reader in some faraway time, but as a living, breathing soul, a soul sitting quietly, perhaps with tears that have long dried on your cheeks, a soul who has carried burdens without complaint, who has smiled while silently aching, who has kept going when it would have been easier to stop. He would not pity you. No, Seneca did not believe in the kind of pity that weakens. He believed in reverence for every soul who chooses to stay, to sit, to keep walking through the silent woods of their loneliness with dignity intact. He would write, there is no shame in solitude. There is no failure in silence. There is only the beginning of your return to yourself. Because that is what so few ever realize. Solitude isn't about being alone. It's about meeting the one person you'll spend your whole life with, yourself. And most people never truly do. They decorate the outside, they chase the external, but they forget to explore the depths of their own mind, their own heart. Seneca would remind you gently, your mind is not a prison. It is a temple, but only if you learn how to enter it. And how do we enter? With courage, with stillness, with intention, not by rushing, not by distracting, but by softening, by paying attention, by daring to ask, what have I been avoiding? You see, most loneliness doesn't come from the world abandoning us. It comes from us abandoning ourselves, from turning away from our truth, from silencing our voice, from outsourcing our sense of belonging. Seneca knew this well. He saw powerful men surrounded by flattery and yet completely alone. He saw public figures praised by thousands and yet consumed by emptiness. He understood what many still don't, that being seen is not the same as being known, that noise is not the same as connection, and he would encourage you to ask a radical question. What if this loneliness isn't asking to be fixed, but to be felt? What if it's not a problem, but a portal? What if underneath the ache there is a doorway, to depth, to understanding, to peace? Because here's the paradox. It is only when we stop fighting the silence that we begin to hear its music, the quiet rhythm of our own breath, the return of forgotten dreams. The voice we've been ignoring gently calling us back home. Seneca might say, in times of solitude the soul speaks most clearly. Listen closely, for it does not shout, it whispers. And you begin to wonder, how long has it been whispering? How many years have you missed the messages in your own silence? How many times have you reached outward when the wisdom was already within? He would not judge you for this. He would only remind you it's not too late, it never is. As long as breath remains, the return is possible. The reconnection is waiting. And loneliness, rather than a void, becomes the invitation. Because in Stoicism, the external is never the problem. It is always the interpretation, the framing, the story we attach. You are not unloved. You are simply being invited to love yourself in a new, deeper way. You are not abandoned. You are being asked to come back to your own side. You are not broken. You are being reassembled by silence itself. Seneca would encourage you to walk into this moment, not as a victim, but as a philosopher, as a student of the soul, with curiosity, with openness, with humility. And slowly, gently, as the silence deepens, you begin to see the truth he spoke of, that solitude is not loneliness, that silence is not emptiness, that you are not alone, not truly, because you are finally with yourself. He might close this part of the letter with a line as simple as it is eternal. Learn to be your own friend. Then, even when alone, you are not. Imagine this. Seneca sets down his stylus and walks to the window of his quiet villa in exile. The countryside is still. The wind barely moves the leaves. There is no applause, no forum, no crowd. And yet, he breathes deeply, completely, because in that silence, he remembers who he is. He is not a senator, not an advisor, not a name carved in stone. He is a soul, thinking, breathing, present, and that is enough. He would turn back, pick up the stylus again, and write to you. Why do you seek yourself in the reflection of others, when your own soul stands beside you in silence, waiting to be seen? This is what loneliness often hides, that we are not longing for others. We are longing to return to ourselves. We think it's about them, the friends, the lover, the community, but it's not really. It's about the disconnection we've built within, when we stopped listening to our inner life and instead tried to live through borrowed voices. Seneca would remind you, the wise soul knows that time alone is not time wasted, it is time gathered. He would encourage you to become a gatherer of solitude, to see each quiet evening not as a sentence, but as a sanctuary, a place where your thoughts no longer need to compete, where your breath becomes a steady rhythm again, where your value is not measured by interaction, but by insight. And this does not mean withdrawing from life. Seneca was not a hermit. He engaged in politics, in conflict, in deep love and deep loss, but he learned how to hold the world at a gentle distance, not out of fear, but out of reverence for his own center. And he would wish the same for you, that you might live in the world but not lose yourself in it, that you might meet your solitude, not as a shadow, but as a teacher. Because silence, he'd say, teaches in a way no voice can. It does not argue, It does not shame. It simply reveals. And that revelation, though uncomfortable at first, becomes the very tool of your liberation. He would ask you now, have you tried sitting with your pain, not as something to eliminate, but as something to understand? This, he believed, was the Stoic path, not to escape suffering, but to interpret it differently, to use it, to learn from it, because suffering reveals what we value, what we've depended on, what we must let go of. And in loneliness, you are given the rare chance to examine all of it, the masks, the false attachments, the ways you've tried to earn love instead of simply embodying it. In that silence, you learn the difference between connection and dependence, between attention and meaning, between being liked and being at peace. Seneca would guide you step by step back to your internal ground, and with every step, you'd feel lighter, not because the pain is gone, but because you're no longer carrying the weight of pretending. You're just being. And isn't that what your soul has wanted all along? Not more noise, not more people, just the space to breathe. He would write, "Cease to hope that others will rescue you. The soul that can rescue itself is already free." Not because you don't need others, we all do, but because your foundation must first be within. And when it is, when your silence becomes strength, then every relationship becomes richer. Not because it fills your emptiness, but because it reflects your fullness. And maybe in that fullness you'll begin to feel the subtle shift Seneca knew so well. The ache of solitude softens, the silence feels less sharp, and in its place, stillness. A stillness that steadies you, holds you, strengthens you, and from that strength you begin to rebuild, not as someone desperate to be found, but as someone who has already found themselves and now walks back into the world with calm eyes and a quieter heart. And so now, as Seneca's letter reaches its final lines, he would not rush. His words would slow, soften, settle like dust in a sunlit room. He would want these last thoughts to live with you, not as decoration, but as nourishment. Not as philosophy to admire, but as breath to return to when the world grows cold again. He would say, loneliness is not a flaw in the world. It is a mirror, offering you a view of yourself undistorted by noise. He would not promise that. Solitude will always be pleasant. No wise teacher ever does, but he would promise that it will always be honest. That the silence you find when you are alone is not your enemy. It is the voice beneath all the noise you've been too distracted to hear. He might add, if you listen long enough, you will hear not emptiness, but presence. Not a void, but a vessel. You are not hollow, you are vast. Seneca knew that the strongest people were not the ones who stood in crowds, collecting praise like coins. They were the ones who could sit in silence and still know their worth. He knew that loneliness isn't cured by people. It's healed by truth, by the unwavering stillness of a soul who is no longer waiting to be rescued. You don't need rescuing. You need remembering. Remember who you are when there is no one to impress. Remember who you are when no one texts back. Remember who you are when it's quiet and the room is still and your heart is louder than your thoughts. You are not the version of yourself others have constructed. You are not the echo of past wounds or the ghost of forgotten affection. You are here, now, fully alive, even in pain, especially in pain. And Seneca would want you to know that this moment, this quiet, aching moment, is not the end. It's the beginning, the first breath after the fall, the clearing after the storm, the place where the roots begin to grow, because now, finally, the ground is still enough to receive them. He would encourage you to continue the practice. Write to yourself. Sit with yourself. Speak to your soul as you would to a dear friend. And let solitude become sacred again, he'd say. You are not here to wait for love. You are here to become it. And once you do, once you stop expecting others to fill your silence and instead fill it with understanding, with purpose, with patience, you will see the world differently. You will walk into rooms not wondering who notices you, but wondering who needs to be seen. You will speak not to be heard, but to build. You will love not to complete yourself, but to express what you have already become. That is the transformation silence offers. That is the gift within the ache. So if you are here now, still listening, still breathing, still wondering what this all means, know this: your loneliness is not a mistake. It is your teacher. And its lesson is simple, eternal, and powerful. You are enough, even in silence, especially in silence. Seneca's final words in this letter might be few. He never believed in excess. But every syllable would carry weight. Stay, listen, return. Your soul is still here, and it is not empty. It is quietly waiting for you to remember it. And with that, he would set down his pen, not to end the conversation, but to let it echo inside you, as it should. Because the rest of the letter, it is yours to write now. If these Stoic quotes helped you find peace in your loneliness, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More Stoic wisdom is on the way. And leave a dot so I know you were here.